Always appreciate talking to our next guest. He is a highly influential political writer. He is Washington correspondent for The Nation, and he also writes the Beat blog for The Nation. John Nichols, thanks as always for joining us.
I aspire to be as influential as my host.
Well, you influence me.
It's a pleasure to be on with you, my friend.
Thanks. And listen, the last time we had you on, we talked about Scott Walker and the dark shadows surrounding his aura. Let's brighten up a little bit and talk about candidate you've been covering a lot lately, Bernie Sanders. And there were two things I wanted to talk to you about regarding Bernie Sanders. One is you make some great points about his history, past successes, and who he is as a candidate. But let's start with this, if you don't mind. You wrote your book on socialism in America. We've talked about that in the past. Bernie Sanders describes himself as a democratic socialist, the first major candidate in as long as I can remember on the national level to do so. What is a democratic socialist in this time, in this place?
A democratic socialist is someone who believes that there is a lot that people can do together that they might not be able to do on their own. And that perhaps the most important thing that people do together that they couldn't do on their own is provide a counterbalance to the power of multinational corporations, very, very wealthy people. And what I mean by a counterbalance, it is that you take the ability of people to coalesce, either in perhaps a workers' co-op or a community-owned utility, or as you move up that food chain, political food chain, into state government, national government, where you'd have the government do some things that people can't do for themselves, and that corporations, very, very wealthy individuals, seem to only be willing to do for profit. And the best example of this internationally is the provision of health care. Most countries in the world cannot imagine the idea that you would make health care a for-profit operation that would determine the amount of care you get, the quality of care you get, based on your wealth. Most countries in the world see health care as a right, and they don't reduce it to a for-profit operation. They figure out how to make sure people get the health care they need. This is also done in countries around the world, including many of our closest allies, and the United States' closest allies, in areas of education, social service, housing. And democratic socialism is nothing radical. In fact, in the overall scheme of the world, democratic socialism is a very mainstream political ideal as well as political reality. In America, it's been demonized for a long time. But the thing that I've always tried to communicate and remind people of is that while it has often been demonized, it's also been very much a part of our political reality. And people need to recognize that, a term like Social Security, the social in there means socialized, people coming together to do something. When we talk about so many of our accomplishments as a society, many of our great leaps forward have come at the counsel of, with the encouragement of, American democratic socialists, and also with the reality that Democratic and Republican presidents in the past often had democratic socialists as their counselors, as their aides, and as their touchstones, people that gave them ideas about how to move forward. So it's not some foreign concept. It's not some dangerous concept, but it is one that we have not heard a lot about of late, and Bernie Sanders is inserting it into our discourse, apparently with some success.
And what's interesting about it, and John, we've talked about this in the past, the phrase itself has been successfully marginalized by the right and then by the center-right and so on over many years. But as you point out with your example of Social Security, the DNA of the idea itself, the principle itself, is not only present in our government, in our lives, but is extremely popular. Social Security is enormously popular. Vast majorities across the political spectrum, including 75% of Republicans, want to expand Social Security. In other words, they want a more socialist approach to the retirement problem. Similarly, Medicare, which is a socialist program in the democratic socialist sense, is highly popular. So, to an extent, is Bernie Sanders, by embracing the term instead of running from it, is he sort of recapturing or reclaiming the label, the terminology, and trying to rescue it from demonization?
Well, it's a very noble concept that there might be a recapturing possible. I have to be honest with you. I think as somebody who's written about this stuff for a long time, I think it really is a new presentation because America has had such limited, such poor coverage of social democratic ideas and values and politics for so long that most Americans aren't aware that, Tony Blair, who wasn't exactly the greatest player in the world, at least in my view, but Tony Blair, one of the great allies of this country over the last 15 years, was a democratic socialist. Right. That, many of the leaders from around the world that our president sits down with and works with, these are democratic socialists. People don't even know that. And they certainly don't know a lot of the dynamics of this history and of these programs. And so my sense is that rather than recapturing, we really are talking about, for the first time in the modern media age, a simple presentation of reality. And I think that is a part of what Bernie Sanders is doing, but I would caution that I don't think it's the center of what he is doing. Mm-hmm. I think the center of what Bernie Sanders is doing is asserting a American variation on an American version of a global response to austerity. I think the whole world right now is crying out, saying, look, we had these ridiculously irresponsible, absurdly irresponsible bankers and CEOs who crashed the global economy, created a huge crisis internationally, and then imposed austerity policies that were designed to make them richer, even as the rest of us sacrificed. The whole world is objecting to this, and in the United States, Bernie Sanders, I would argue, is at the forefront, along with some members of Congress, including Elizabeth Warren, in raising objections to the absurd construct that we found ourselves in. What makes Sanders unique, and what may allow him to get further than some of the other players or figures in this discourse, is that when someone points a finger at him and says, well, that's socialism, what you're talking about, instead of running from the room to hide someplace, Sanders says, yes, it is. Next question. And so he is raising the comfort level with the word, but I don't think that's the central premise of his campaign. I do think the central premise of his campaign is to challenge austerity, and as he suggests, a march in the United States toward oligarchy and plutocracy. A lot of big words, but the simple reality is a pushback against immense power of corporate capital and of billionaire political players.
John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation, he raised an interesting point, fascinating point, by tying the Sanders candidacy and agenda in with the global pushback against austerity. We saw the election of Syriza in Greece. We've seen the rise of, and obviously they're having their struggles now negotiating with the powers that be, but that was to be expected. We have the popularity of Podemos in Spain, and although they're somewhat different, the 5.5 star Italian movement. So we're seeing Alberta, a lot of pushback.
Alberta, the Texas of Canada.
Alberta, I'm sorry. Thank you for mentioning
there
Alberta.
You go.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of it. The election of a very socialist left-wing leadership there. And now we're seeing that, look, Hillary Clinton is still the odds-on favorite to win the Democratic nomination, but we're seeing the mainstreaming, certainly to a certain extent, of this sort of anti-austerity stance. And you point out, it just pivoting to Bernie Sanders as a candidate for a second, you point out, he likes to say, don't underestimate me. And you pointed out in one of your articles, and I had forgotten this, that, we think of Vermont, and you always see this in the press coverage of Vermont, the reliably progressive, a green state of Vermont, that his seat had been, Senate seat had been held by a Republican for how long?
Since 1854. No.
Since 1854, that's a long time. He was just a kid, by the way, when that.
Yeah, Bernie was just getting started.
He wouldn't mind my saying that, but
the Republican Party was founded in 1854.
The point is, this guy beat the odds. He's beat the odds throughout his entire career. So now, where does that leave us in terms of Bernie's candidacy, you think, at this moment in history?
Well, I think it's a big deal. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that Hillary Clinton is a front runner. There's no question of that, and she may well be the nominee. She may well be the president. But I like to actually have campaigns in America. I like the idea of democracy. And so I think it's absolutely vital that Hillary Clinton be challenged in the primaries and in the general election. And what's interesting about Bernie Sanders is that he shows very little inclination to challenge Hillary Clinton based on personality, based on the just empty, useless, negative politics that tends to define about 95% of our election contests. Instead, he's challenging on a host of issues: trade policy, fast track, TPP, a living wage, $15 an hour, a genuine breakup of the big banks so that there are no more too big to fail banks. Fundamental changes, moving toward a single-payer Medicare for all health care plan nationwide. I mean, these are big, bold issues, big, bold ideas. And frankly, while it will be portrayed as a race between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, with some other interesting people like Martin O'Malley, potentially Link Chafee, Jim Webb in the contest, the reality is that what Bernie Sanders is doing is something very, very different. He is, at least to my view, asserting a host of issues that don't get discussed often enough and don't get discussed in the way he will raise them. The initial evidence is that there's a real hunger for this. Yep. 5,000 people showed up for his announcement in his hometown of Burlington. To give you an equivalent, Burlington's a town of about 40,000. If the proportional number of people showed up in New York City, you'd have over 1 million, right? So that's a pretty darn good turnout for your initial announcement there. But then he moved on down to New Hampshire, and Steve Cobble is a longtime political thinker and guy who ran a lot of campaigns over the years, was up there with me. We went to look at this and kind of suss it out. Went down to New Hampshire and watched some of these Sanders events, and in many ways they were more interesting than the Burlington event because the Sanders campaign was not prepared for the crowds. The initial event in Concord, New Hampshire, they had a university space set up quite large, certainly enough for most of the candidates on either side to do an event. It was packed an hour before, and so they started guiding people to a big open area down the street. That was packed by the time Sanders did his first event, and then came down and talked to the people who had waited for 2 hours just to hear him. Then he went on down to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they took one of the largest churches in town, a huge old church with, I hope my estimates aren't wrong here. I'd say 600-700 seats in it. We got there a little bit early, and we thought, wow, it was a pretty bold move here. No. By the time that the event started, they had initially planned to have it downstairs in a little auditorium. They had to move to the core of the church, the sanctuary. It filled the entire downstairs, the entire upstairs, a huge balcony. They had to open the doors, and there were people out the doors into the street. And there was no air conditioning. It was about 85, 90 degrees. This is, you can't make that stuff up. It's real.
We're talking to political writer John Nichols about Bernie Sanders. And, I'd just like to take a second to talk about that aspect you touched on, which is his campaign is getting such a powerful reaction. And I call one dimension of it his meta campaign, meaning that he's kind of campaigning against the way we do political campaigns, too. When he says, the way I interpret it, when he says he's not going to go negative on Hillary Clinton or talk about her emails or her personal life or any of those things, really, in a sense, I mean, that is always, as I understand it, how he's campaigned. And but it's also saying, I think, but curious your thoughts. Well, we campaign in a trivial way. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to only talk about the issues. And so far, you've got a 73-year-old guy only talking about the issues, has 23 of them covered on his website, writes long emails to his supporters, and so on. And he's getting the kind of rock star response that would suggest there's a real hunger for that, as you say. So isn't the meta campaign part of this?
It's hugely part of it, but you nailed it. I think you're exactly right. It strikes me that almost everything about Bernie Sanders' candidacy is A, completely absurd in the current context, right?
Yeah.
73-year-old white-haired Democratic socialist going out, from the pretty much one of the smallest states in the country, taking on the former Secretary of State, former First Lady, former U.S. Senator, very, very powerful political force, and then proposing to, if by some chance he became the Democratic nominee, take on the Bush family or Scott Walker and things like that. I mean, it's a huge construct, and yet it's just total happy warrior stuff. I mean, he's out there, he shows up at these events, and of course, Bernie Sanders is a very, very serious guy. He likes to talk about issues. So instead of doing a whole bunch of, walking up the middle of the room and shaking every hand and going for the big image, no, he comes out. There's usually some local person who introduces him, and then bang, he's hardcore into issues, and it's just issue after issue after issue, explanation after explanation after explanation. Usually an hour-long speech, which is quite a bit in politics, except it is interrupted constantly by standing ovations. Not even because I think, in my view, that Bernie Sanders is necessarily articulating things perfectly, but it's just people haven't heard it. They're like, whoa, you're kidding me, right? You're actually talking about, seriously, Medicare for all, single payer? Standing ovation. You're actually talking about free college? Standing ovation. And then, when it's done, he takes questions. I guess, I wasn't there in Iowa last night, so I don't know, but I understand he took 2 hours of questions. But I did see in New Hampshire a couple nights ago. It was an amazing situation. Question after question, real people all through the crowd, and one woman got up and talked about a child, her child, who has a learning disability, a very serious one. And that child is getting older. This woman was getting older, and she said, I'm terrified that my child is going to be around when I'm gone, and that this society won't take care of my child. A very poignant, deep moment.
Right.
Sanders goes straight into it, very serious, lots of details. He actually talks about being on the Senate committee, and remember, Sanders is 26 years in Congress, so he kind of knows his way, or 25 years, he knows his way around a lot of these issues. But he goes into it very deeply. This is where it got interesting, Richard. The next question is from somebody asking about nuclear weaponry and continuing to build and expand nuclear capacity and the military-industrial complex. I guarantee you've rarely, if ever, seen this in politics. Sanders goes, I'm so glad you asked that question. It relates exactly to the question we had before.
Right,
Here we have a woman standing up saying, I'm afraid this society won't take care of my child in the years to come. And then you're getting up and saying, yeah, but our society is about to spend trillions on a military-industrial complex. And then he went into a discussion of priorities. And I'm telling you, there's nothing about this that is standard soundbite politics. But nobody left that packed room on that 85, 90-degree night. They stayed and they listened. And when it finished, they were just, I don't know. I don't want to overplay
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but that's a great story, and I hope you'll keep on covering Bernie Sanders, and it's nice to talk to you about something positive. John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, my friend.
You bet. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this on the Zero Hour.